Page 228 continued. Chapter 7, The Segmentary State and the Indian Experience, asterisk mark. Para. Aiden Southall has written a significant and provocative piece which raises several questions regarding the form and nature of the state in early India. Footnote 1. He argues that insights derived from the study of tribal polities in Africa, particularly those from his study of the Alur society, can be used to explain the form of the state and its dynamics in India. In general, anthropological insight should be welcomed by historians of early societies. I am always willing to use the known Indian phenomenon, including the African, for understanding social, economic, and political processes in India, and the present-day historians of India who deal with its ancient and early medieval periods are not averse to this approach too. It is therefore unfair to credit Indian historians, as Southall does, with the arrogance of regarding Indian culture as unique. Pages 53, 82, footnote 3. Para. Bartenstein, who follows Southall, adds that, quote, comparisons with, and even borrowing from, Europe had been acceptable, even eagerly sought, whereas merely a structural comparison of Indian and African forms gives offense to many Indians. Unquote. Stop 4. Stein not only ignores the importance of the comparative method in historical studies, but also the fact that European history has been taught in India for nearly 200 years, and that the colonial masters never introduced any African history except that of ancient Egypt or the partition of Africa in the 1880s. Indian historians have been influenced by Western writings, but not to the extent of entertaining the, quote, segmentary, unquote, and similar other untenable constructs. The use of anthropology, including the African, for explaining historical processes is a recent phenomenon, page 229. But to say that many Indians feel offended by such an exercise, 5, is an outburst in despair. I very much hope that such allegations are not intended to prejudice the educated Africans against Indian scholars, though such an effect cannot be avoided. Those who find the Alur analogy of the segmentary state inapplicable to the Chola polity are not Southall's, quote, revivalists, unquote, and, quote, chauvinists, chauvinists, unquote, but enlightened empiricists. Footnote 6. On the contrary, Southall's attempt to elevate ritualism over economic and political processes in early times is in tune with the attempt of some present-day revivalist historians to make religion the main factor in early Indian history. Fieldwork versus historical method. Whether the results of fieldwork deserve more weight than the various methods used by historians for tackling the source material is questionable. Southall gives the impression that fieldwork is more important than what he calls, quote, cumulative verification, unquote, adopted by historians, page 81. This is too big a claim. The historian's method of verification is not only cumulative, but also corroborative. Various types of sources, including reports of fieldwork, are used to find confirmatory evidence for a fact or a generalization. The end product of this exercise, in my opinion, is far more reliable than the subjective method of fieldwork in which informants say what they feel or are made to feel. Their statements do not necessarily indicate the actual reason for an event. Southall does not see the existence of multiple polities within the Alur society, and yet, on the basis of information that he receives, he visualizes their presence. He says, quote, I never observed Alur society working as independent polity with my own eyes, unquote, page 54. Interestingly enough, he does not trust the contemporary Portuguese account when it describes the Vijayanagar and Congo states as feudal, page 73, but heavily relies on the result of his fieldwork in the case of the Alur. Modern fieldworks are no doubt more sophisticated than Portuguese descriptions, but contemporary accounts cannot be dismissed summarily. A critical historian would be wary of the results of only one field study of a tribal society, however thorough and penetrating it may be in itself, page 230. He would seek their corroboration from other similar works on the same society or several other tribal societies belonging to the same level of social and economic development. 7 para. Southall himself doubts the dependability of fieldwork when he points out that different views of the state are derived by anthropologists from the same kind of material, page 53. Obviously, different models are produced from the same type of material because different researchers handle it with different approaches and methods. It is evident that Southall looks at the Alur material on the basis of his understanding of S. F. Nardell's work, 8 para. The role of ritualism in polity is of vital importance to Southall. Yet, as he says, quote, if I speak of the rights of royal succession, I speak from hearsay, unquote, stop. I do not possess much idea of the mechanism of fieldwork, semicolon. But a researcher cannot afford to rely on hearsay, stop. I have talked intimately to my illiterate fellow villagers who attribute many things to destiny. How can I take their view to be the correct explanation of what happens to them individually and collectively, question mark. Similarly, the Alurs may believe that their king is the rainmaker and that he brings fertility to the soil. Such beliefs are fostered in the common people by the priests and other members of the dominant interest groups to make them believe in the effective authority of the supreme surplus collector and distributor. This certainly happens in a class-divided developed society. The Egyptians were made to believe that the pharaoh represented the sun god, and hence they gave obedience to him. Even in chiefdoms or in advanced tribal societies, such beliefs may have been promoted by those who tried to change ranks into classes. We therefore have to take note of the element of, quote, subjectivity, unquote, provided by the society on which we work. At the same time, we have to consider the element of, quote, objectivity, unquote, provided by historical generalizations based on a comparative view of many societies with more or less similar levels of modes of subsistence. Divine acts in society are patterned after human acts. Supernatural beings and the rituals associated with them are conceived after human beings, page 231, and their behavior. A society is to be judged or understood not only by the image its dominant or ordinary members form of themselves, Illusions have to be checked with the reality which creates them. People's perceptions are important to the extent to which they move them to action. But how beliefs and perceptions are formed is far more relevant to the understanding of historical processes. Concept of the state. Southall bases his concept of the state on that of Nadel. Footnote 9. He sums up Nadel's concept as comprising, quote, territorial sovereignty, unquote, centralized government, specialized administrative staff, and monopoly of the use of legitimate force. 10. To this he adds two more elements. According to him, quote, the state has several levels of subordinate foci, FOCI, organized pyramidally, and the people may shift their allegiance from one power pyramid to another. Unquote, stop 11. In his view, each one of these elements of the state may be limited in nature, and the criteria of the full state may not be achieved. 12. Southall neither discusses the interdependence of the various elements constituting the state nor their relative importance. He ignores that the mechanism evolved by a class or interest group to collect the surplus from the primary producers is the vital element in a system which claims to be a state. Even in Nadel's definition of the state, Southall misses the significance of the existence of a privileged ruling class. In Nadel's words, quote, the state involves the existence of a specialized privileged ruling group or class separated in training, status and organization from the main body of the population. Unquote, stop 13. This class, which according to Nadel corporately, quote, monopolizes the machinery of political control, unquote, could originate as a result of internal diversification or external conquest. But in his search for an alternative to the two factors, Southall emphasizes the voluntary submission aspect, which in his view characterizes the Allur state. However, the voluntary subjection induced by the mystic or charismatic power of the dominant group in the initial state of its advance may be mostly a myth sedulously fostered by that group. Page 232. The Allur society, not a state. Southall calls the Allur society a state, which is a misnomer in that context. Though the Allurs inhabit a territory, they are lacking in the essentials of a state. They do not have a system of taxation, a professional soldiery, and a bureaucracy. The Allur society does not have whole-time specialists who could be supported with the surplus produce made available by the people. As Southall states, the Allur political economy did not produce sufficient surplus which could be mobilized to enable the rulers to establish such specialists as fire makers, skin softeners, or milkers. They did not have full-time iron-working specialists. Page 61. In the absence of the availability of sufficient surplus, the basic ingredients of the state system could not be established in the Allur society. Southall's postulate raises a series of fundamental questions. How do we then distinguish between a pre-state and state society? What is common between the Allur state and the early historical states that we know? What does one make of the impersonal bureaucratic basis of the state, which unmistakably cuts across keen ties? Para, according to our understanding, quote, a state is established primarily to protect the interests of the class or the interest group which lives either on the surplus collected from the producers or on the possession of a larger share of the means of production, 14, and is equipped with some essential instruments, including the coercive apparatus, to perform its functions, unquote, stop. When a few families of a clan come to control metals, tools, etc., regulate marriage for perpetuating privileges or for reproducing labor power, exploit the labor of the kinsmen not in communal interest but for their own benefit, and claim to receive a fixed share of the surplus at fixed point of time, they turn the interest group into a class. But such classes are not noticed in the Alur society. It shows rank differences but not classes corresponding to Varnas in ancient India, 15, or corresponding to landlords and peasants in medieval Indian society, 16. It is held that the ruling Atyak, A-T-Y-A-K lineage grew faster because of its polygamy and wealth which has not been clearly identified, but there is nothing to show that the lineage lived on the surplus produced by the commoners, page 59. Page 233. Whatever contributions the chief received were kept as prestige goods by the rulers and used by them for occasional ritual distribution. Page 60 FN. It will therefore appear that the system of tax collection or the necessity of its disbursement to public officers did not arise. Hence, the mechanism developed by the Alurs could at best be called a, quote, proto-state, unquote, stop. Ritual suzerainty and political suzerainty. Southall defines the segmentary state as, quote, basically one in which the sphere of ritual suzerainty is distinguished from that of political suzerainty, unquote, page 52. This means fragmentation of political authority into two, which was typical of early medieval Europe and is noticed prominently by historians. But in historical times, as different from prehistoric times, religious suzerainty is derived from political suzerainty and follows it. In Mesopotamia, if one city conquered the other city, the conqueror's god became the presiding deity of the conquered city. Thus, the Assyrian god, Assur, A-S-S-U-R, became the god of the cities that were conquered by the Assyrians. On the other hand, in order to assimilate the conquered people, the Indian conquerors adopted their gods and goddesses into the dominant Brahminical pantheon. Para. In ancient India, though the princes and the priests formed members of the ruling class living on taxes, tributes, and gifts, yet functionally they formed two distinct categories. Continuous competition and occasionally open conflict went on between the two for pelf, P-E-L-F, and power, so that one might grab a larger share of the surplus collected from the peasants at the cost of the other. There are many instances of such fights. At the same time, in critical situations, such fights were not pushed to the extreme because that would jeopardize the very existence of the ruling segments, which considered it essential to coexist and cooperate in order to be able to collect taxes, tributes, forced labor, gifts, etc., from the common peasants, artisans, and other producing sections of the society. In the Varna-divided ancient Indian society, the king was not primarily concerned with ritual and religious functions which were performed by the Brahmanas. Page 234, para. In later Vedic times, when a bitter struggle ensued to convert voluntary gifts made by the kinsmen into mandatory payments, the rituals were fabricated by the Brahmanas to buttress political power. 17. The need arose because of the reluctance of the Vaishyas or the tribal peasantry to pay. Superstitious devices were recommended by the Arthashastra of Kautilya to collect more taxes from the people. 18. Therefore, Indian experience does not suggest any ritual suzerainty and political suzerainty to be exercised separately by the ruler, the first in the peripheral and the second in the core area. Para. Ritual suzerainty is confused by Saudol with cultural suzerainty. Elements of Indian culture certainly spread in Central Asia and Southeast Asia in early times and supplemented the indigenous contribution to the growth of various national personalities. But can we argue that India enjoyed ritual suzerainty over Central Asia and Southeast Asia? Para. It is difficult to attribute both political and ritual suzerainty to an Indian king because political authority and functions were attributed to the Kshatriya and ritual authority and functions to the Brahmanas. At some stages in early Indian history, the conflict between the two was as acute as between the church and the state in medieval Europe. But India never had anything like the Holy Roman Empire, which was later regarded neither holy nor Roman nor empire. Para. The view that political authority operated in the core area and ritual suzerainty in the peripheral area cannot be sustained. 19. Although the distinction between the core and the periphery can be useful. 20. Rituals and religious beliefs were doubtless manipulated to strengthen political power in all areas, core, intermediate, regional and sub-regional, marginal and sub-marginal. The tax-collecting superstitious measures recommended by Kautilya are meant for all areas. However, in pre-industrial or in pre-capitalist times, central authority could operate effectively in a limited area. If a revolt took place in Bengal, it would take at least 1 month for the news to reach either Agra or Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire. Page 235. The Maurya central authority may have been effective in the middle Ganga plains and the Chola central authority in the Tanjore area. But it would be wrong to confine ritual or religious authority to the periphery and political authority to the core. The wide spatial distribution of certain fiscal terms over a long period of time, as shown in N. Karasimha et al., South Indian History and Society, 21, and convincingly used by Kesavan Veluthat, negates this kind of assumed dichotomy. 22. A full-length study of the taxation system under the Cholas, 23, disproves the distinction between the ritual authority in the peripheral and political authority in the core area. Para. H. Kulke, in his work on medieval Orissa, sees, quote, religion not as a substitute for political authority but as its promoter, unquote. Stop. 24. More recently, Stein seems to admit close interrelationship between religion and politics, quote. In India, I am now convinced that the distinction is incorrect, semicolon. Lordship for Hindus always and necessarily combine ritual and political authority, ... unquote, 25. Next section, ritual suzerainty and the Chola kingdom.